On behalf of Jason and the SABR Baseball Cards Committee, would like to welcome everybody to our fourth annual Jefferson Burdick Award presentation. Today we will be honoring Fred Harris, and I will just hand it off to Jeff Katz, who will take it away and be mainly the master of ceremonies for the rest of it. But just wanted to say thanks for coming on this weekend. And if you're on the East Coast, I know it's pretty rainy for a lot of us. So good day to be on Zoom. All right, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Nick. So welcome, everybody. Having been involved with the Baseball Card Committee when it was restarted by Mark Armour and Chris Dial and the creation of this award, the spirit behind this award is, the joy of why we collect, what makes this a hobby that we care about. And all our previous award winners, from Mike Arenstein, Doug McWilliams, Jim Beckett, they really represented that well. And as we talked about this year, Fred Harris and Brendan Boyd's book, as we showed before, the Great American Baseball Card Flipping, Trading, and Bubblegum book, is so important to so many of us. When it came out, I was 10 going on 11, really at the beginnings of collecting seriously. And one, to see so many cards, people who are newer to the hobby can't quite understand that we didn't know what these cards look like. We didn't see these cards. So to have a treasure trove of photos was one thing. The second thing was in the writing. It was so funny and joyful. Probably some of it went over our 10 and 11-year-old heads at the time, but it was a book that you could constantly read and made a huge mark on all of us. So to honor Fred and Brendan made perfect sense to the committee, and to have Fred here to participate is really a joy and an honor. So Fred Harris, welcome. Congratulations on your award. And we can kind of get right into it. Fred and I talked last week, so we have kind of a general idea here. But Fred, I was wondering if you could kind of tell everybody your background as a baseball fan, as a card collector, and really kind of getting us to the idea that there was a book in your future.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for the award. I mean, it's humbling for me because, as you will discover, I think, over the course of the next little while, I'm not really a collector. I am a baseball fan, as all of you guys are as well. And I love baseball cards. It was obviously from the book, it was a very big part of my childhood and my adulthood for that matter. But anyway, I started back I was born in New York, but wasn't old enough to be a baseball fan. By the time I lived in Philadelphia and was a hardcore Phillies fan. And I saw something on eBay today. It was a Wawa t-shirts in the Phillies color. And I almost bought it, but I have loyalty to the Boston Red Sox. I've lived up in this area now for just about 50 years. And, but anyway, I started back in the 50s as a Phillies fan at Shibe Park, Connie Mack Stadium. Some of you may be familiar with that, where I had virtually the entire bleachers to myself because they weren't drawing flies back then, after 1950. And I have fond memories of going to games by myself. Those were back in the day when my mother said, go out and play and come back at dinner time. It was a very different time. And I used to go to a lot of Phillies games, and baseball cards were there when I was a kid, and Bowman cards, as you can see from the background, were my big thing. I happen to love the design and just the feel of them, the penny packs and the nickel packs and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't really think in terms of collecting. I mean, as you know from the book, we did things like put the cards in the spokes of our bikes to make motorcycle sounds and stuff like that. And grew up as always a baseball fan, grew up and went to college at Penn State in the 1960s. got a bachelor's and a master's degree and worked toward a PhD there and thought I might want to be a professor, but also wanted to avoid the Vietnam draft at the time, which I did a pretty good job of. But I got kind of tired with the whole academic thing toward the late 60s. Any of you who were old enough at that time to have lived through that period as a young adult, maybe, know how turbulent it was and difficult and just trying to keep your focus. But I moved on to retail and started working in a bookstore in Boston on Boylston Street called Book Clearinghouse. Wonderful old bookstore, no longer there, hasn't been there for years. And found that I enjoyed the business end of it and the book end of it, of course. And one of my best friends in the store was the assistant manager, who was Brendan Boyd. And we hit it off. You know, there's certain people in your life where you don't see them for 20 years and you see them and you pick up the conversation without any problem. Brendan was always like that. Unfortunately, I've lost touch with him since the latest edition of the book was published back in the 90s. And he basically said, you can have it, I don't want it. I said, don't you want to go promote it with me, go tour and stuff? And he said, no. I haven't heard from him, and a close friend of mine who knows him fairly well said that he passed away a few years ago.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because he would make a good a good partner on this afternoon. I wish he was here to share it because we had a special relationship. But anyway, a couple of guys standing around in the store, in that bookstore, swapping stories about baseball, and one thing led to another.
Yeah. So I know we have a Boston contingent here. So Fred told me last week that I think before he worked at the bookstore, he worked at Brigham's Ice Cream.
Ah, yeah.
So for you Boston people, there's some authenticity there. So yeah, you met Brendan at the bookstore, and the way you told it to me last year is, and it's funny, I don't think I referenced this to you, but I was referencing it to some of the guys beforehand. It reminds me of stories I've heard about Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner and the 2,000-Year-Old Man. They used to just do it at parties, and then someone said, you should make a record. And you talked about how you and Brendan would just talk about the players, and Dick McDonough, who was an editor at Little Brown, I think you told me.
Well, at the time we were both working in that store, he was the manager of the store.
Yeah.
But Little Brown had recruited him as somebody who knew a lot about the book business to become an editor at Little Brown. Yeah.
Right. So he heard you guys telling stories and then said, I have an idea. Like, how did the whole idea come together in what we ended up seeing on our bookshelves?
Yeah, that's really very close to what happened. Went to work there, I think, in the fall of 1968, and Brendan had been there for a few months. And over the course of 68 and 69, you know, it was a busy store, but when we had an opportunity to get together, we just sort of fell into a conversation about baseball cards and wacky players and names and looks and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, Dick did overhear it, and he remembered the bond that we had over that subject when he became editor at Little Brown. And just about the time he became editor at Little Brown was purchased by Sports Illustrated. And Sports Illustrated was really flourishing at the time. It's now a shell of what it used to be. And you guys, I'm sure, remember it during the good days. But they had a lot of money to spend, and they thought, well, let's see, are there any books on your list or any ideas that might work for us as a book? And obviously Dick thought of Brendan and myself, and one thing, and that lit the fire under us to actually start writing some of this stuff down.
Right. You had said it was something that you talked about. You didn't necessarily have notes. And how did the cards become part of the storytelling and eventually the book?
Well, at one point, we said, once we had the possibility of a book contract, and we had to provide an outline, we said, we really have to get some cards. Where are we going to get cards? Well, we could buy cards, you know, at the corner, but we don't want those cards. We want cards that we had and we collected. And of course, my mother threw them all out when I went off to Penn State, as many moms did. And with my, you know, my okay, I didn't care at that point whether she kept them. They weren't perceived as being valuable in any tangible way. And Brendan had a few cards, and he contacted his mother, and she sent him a box with some just random cards and random condition. And those are the cards, many of them that you see in the book. It wasn't as though there wasn't really anywhere to go to get cards, old cards, you know. The network wasn't really established at the time. I guess there were a few publications.
Sorry to interrupt. Are you starting to write this in like 70, 71?
Starting to write it probably at the end of 69 into 70.
Okay.
I think the contract, if I recall correctly, an actual contract came into play in like the end of 70 into 71.
Got it. Okay.
So 71, 72, as authors will dawdle, you know, writing a book and putting it together. It finally got published in early 73. But we wrote it over the course of probably a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah. So it's interesting that particularly that time frame, I think the first real card shows started springing up maybe in 72, 73. So really in 70, 71, there were no card shows to go to. There were no card shops. Yeah, so finding them. And so Brendan's cards became a big leap. So you told me something last week that I didn't know, is how you guys divvied up who was going to write about who. Yeah,
we figured we had to have a sort of demarcation line to just make some kind of order to this process. So since I grew up in Philly, I said, I'll take the Phillies. And he said, I said, I'll take the National League. And Brendan said, I'll take the American League. And that was the rough dividing line. So we looked at the cards we had, we split them National, American, and then we took cards from each pack that we especially wanted to talk about or write about.
Right.
That's
so who got Johnny Unitas? Who did Johnny Unitas?
That was Brendan. Yeah.
Because
it just had to be. I was lucky Johnny was part of that mix, because that's one of the cards that most people remember.
Yeah, it's funny. I was saying to Fred, the first old football card I got was that 1960 Johnny Unitas because of this book. So very impactful segment. When the book came out, so it came out in early 73, you said?
Early 73,
yeah. It was
actually published, yeah.
Did it change your life, yours and Brendan's life? Did it sell a lot? Did it, how did it spread? Because it certainly spread to the middle of Long Island where I got mine.
Well, the way books, you know, as I said, it was a very different time in the book business and publishing industry back then. If you were lucky enough to get a company like Little Brown to publish a book, you made some money, upfront money, and advance against royalties. And as I recall, my part of the advance was something in the neighborhood of maybe $5,000 or $10,000. Now,
pretty good.
That was good money, man. That's, you know, it's really good money.
Yeah.
And at that point, when the book was actually published, I had moved beyond bookstores. I mean, local bookstore like Book Clearinghouse, to working for a chain of bookstores in Boston, which some of the Boston people here might recognize. Laureate's Books. They were around until probably the late 80s, early 90s. Solid chain of New England bookstores based in Boston. And so but I was working for them and traveling a lot. And I didn't really have the opportunity to do much book promotion at that time. And Brendan, I guess, he had left the store as well. And he was working on a book about the 1919 World Series, the Black Sox scandal and all that. A novel actually called Blue Ruin, which is a really good book, I think. And he basically pursued a writing career, where I pursued a retail career at that point. So he had more time, so he could do the trip down to Tops and stuff like that.
Right.
And I kept, you know, writing and about those players from the National League, and the book finally came together. But the promotion part was all on Brendan at that point. I think he did a great job.
Yeah, I mean, it was all over. You had mentioned it was a New York Times notable book. Was that at the time, or at the end of the year, whenever they did it? Yeah.
I wish I kept those reviews, because I mean there were some solid reviews that came through. Both individual reviewers and the clout of the New York Times behind it was a big deal back in the day. I guess it still is for
Yeah.
authors now. But the first printing, as I recall, was 20,000 copies.
Wow.
Now, I don't know whether that's today that's perceived as large or small. It was pretty
I think it's
significant
pretty
back
large.
then.
I think it's pretty
And
large today.
what was exciting was that once the book was published and it got out into stores, it was selling well enough that they immediately went back to press for another 10,000.
Nice.
And that might have been on their part a mistake because I think we hit most of the people at about 20,000. But and that sort of goes back to the cases of books that had been remaindered or closed out that I saw in that warehouse
Right.
in New York that I should have bought, you know. But the other thing they did at that time, very quickly after they went back for another 10K, was to publish what's called a trade paperback, which you held up the 1993 edition or the 91 edition that you were showing before. It's the same size
So Paul, yours is the paperback?
Pardon me?
Paul Ember's holding up a paperback, but I think that's from the 90s. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's the 90s. That's probably the one you guys would have. But there was a trade paperback in there too, which trade paperbacks, lower price point, a little more distribution. I think they did probably 50 or 75K on that. And that sold really well. Well enough so that Warner Books, which was then a Time Life Sports Illustrated property, published what was called a mass market paperback, which was a small size paperback that you now see on racks in airports and places like that. And the printing on that was like 250,000 copies. So, but the distribution on that was enormous, and there were a lot of those that were returned. So it was,
It's interesting.
I'd be curious to know if any of you guys had ever seen that one. That was an interesting edition.
Yeah,
small paperback.
And when you think about pricing, and you're talking about your advance, I mean, the cover price on this book, do you remember?
$7.95.
$7.95.
$7.95.
So, like now it would be a $30 price point.
Easily.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Very different business back then.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about, you brought this up in a way I certainly hadn't thought about before, but 1973 is a very interesting year in terms of 50s nostalgia. I think that's when American Graffiti came out. Happy Days, if it wasn't a series yet, it had been a segment on Love American Style, to date myself. There was, I think in 72, Let the Good Times Roll, this movie about Little Richard and Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry. So what was in the air, do you think, that this 50s came back? Although I will say, you guys were so iconoclastic. Your book reads like a 60s kind of impudent look on the 50s. It's not as warm.
That's a great description. That's a really great description. That's exactly what it is, because we were two guys of the 60s. And we grew up in the 50s, and there were things about the 50s that were triggered by the baseball cards that we talked about and thought about and enjoyed remembering. And we were really, as I said to you before, when we talked before, we were really at that early point of the nostalgia. I don't want to say craze, but it was a very important wave. And if you think back historically to what was happening in that period between like 68 and 72, that was really the end of the 1960s, in terms of the positive hopefulness of the early to mid 60s. And stuff happened, obviously Vietnam, Watergate, Kent State, all those things happened in that time period. And it was very turbulent. And I think our book was, and the whole nostalgia thing was, well, let's look back at a nicer time, more fun time. And that was a big part of it.
And I think for me, and again, and I think I'm speaking for many of us at a certain age level, it didn't read like a 50s homage. It read like an early 70s piece on a different time. And I think, again, I'm sure there's a million jokes that probably went over my head back then, but it felt so grounded in 1973 while also so grounded in the 50s. And I think even the page, I should have bookmarked this, the page with the black background that had Jackie's card and Clemente's card. I mean,
Right.
that was so of the moment when the book
Right.
came out. Was that a late edition? Because that's clearly not part of your writing. It's just,
I think that was an editorial
yeah,
decision from Lil Brown.
yeah.
We
Although
once we
yeah.
presented them with a manuscript, you know, they obviously got involved
Yeah.
as well. So
Yeah, and it is thematic in the sense of a mournful loss
yep,
of a certain time.
yep.
You had talked about when the book was republished in the 90s, and Brendan wasn't interested in doing promotion, but you did a lot of high-level promoting for that
Yeah.
edition, right?
It's funny. I look back on that now and I wonder how I had the time to do it, because I had gone beyond book, you know, a book chain to a retail chain called Hills Department Stores, and they were sort of a precedent of precedent. Yeah, I guess they were like a target of their
Okay.
time. And I was fairly high level in merchandising, and I was then the book got done. Oh no, wait a minute. I'm not remembering that correctly. Go back to 19, say 88, 89, in that
Okay.
time period.
Yeah.
I had just left Hills to start my own company called the Great
Oh.
American Baseball Card Company in Concord, Mass, which was a baseball card store, an early store. I think I wanted to go into business for myself. So, you know, and it was fun at first. It was retail. I knew how to do retail and buying and all that kind of stuff. And my customers were, for the most part, kids who could buy it in 1988, 89, and around there, could certainly buy a pack of baseball cards for 35 cents or 50 cents and not $3. But it stopped being fun after a few years, and I sold it to a couple of partners that I had and moved on to other things. But the opportunity to have a new edition in the early 90s came about while I was in that store, because it was actually someone who lived in Concord who was a literary agent. And I think he must have put two and two together and saw that there was a possibility for that book to have a new edition. So we got it done at Houghton Mifflin, I think it was.
Yeah.
I think the publication date was in 91 or 92 and around there. And they did about 20,000 copies, which was just about the same amount that the original edition in 73 was. And it did fairly well, got good reviews again. And the publisher was willing to put some money behind a promotion. They did some good advertising. I don't know whether you guys had were aware of that edition at the time. Was that your first interaction with it, or do you remember?
Paul Ember, is that the one you have from the early 90s, late 80s?
Yeah, I think it was, yeah. Because a lot of people were affected by that particular edition, a certain demographic. But anyway, the book came out, and part of the promotion was an opportunity to appear with Larry King on his show, and also with David Letterman, that was a terrific experience. Not only because of the opportunity to promote the book and talk about it and to be on the show, but his musical guests that night were Booker T and the MGs, one of my all-time favorite groups. And the great thing about that show is that every time they broke for commercial, Booker T and the MGs played music, and it was so cool, man. One of the highlights of my book.
Experience.
Yeah, it was terrific.
So when you had, for a guy who wasn't a card collector, but now was connected to cards through the book to the point of opening a store named for a card book, you started touching about, like, what did you enjoy? I mean, besides seeing kids come in, like, what did you enjoy about the experience? And I think you had mentioned when Upper Deck came in and things got glossier and more expensive, it kind of turned you off a little bit.
Yeah, it was an interesting time that you guys probably remember at least as well as I do. Topps had lost the monopoly, I guess, in the early 1980s, and all kinds of other players came in and competed with them. And I'm not sure the product got better. I guess it did in some ways. Certainly the gum disappeared at a certain point, but it was enjoyable trying to the merchant in me, the retailer in me, the business guy in me really enjoyed figuring out displays and, what should I buy with a potential of reselling it from a retail standpoint, buy low, sell high, that whole thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of people would wander in with, adults would wander in with their collections to see what they were worth. And at that point, I think Beckett had certainly come out at that point.
Yeah.
And there were a number of shows around, card shows, and there was a regular monthly auction called a company called Hall's Nostalgia here in Boston. They did auctions, and I used to go to those auctions, and I kind of learned about the value of the cards there, and got involved with my own auctions and shows and stuff like that too. But it was just when I think the thing that made the biggest impression on me was Upper Deck when they came out. They were like nothing else that I had seen at that point, and not just the glossiness, but the sharpness of the photography and the design and whatnot, and the price point too. I think they were the first dollar pack, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah.
And they were kind of interesting, but at that point, there was such a glut of product. I started to see, and then I started to see fewer and fewer kids because kids didn't have $1 to spend on the cards like they had the 35 cents or 50 cents or whatever.
Right.
And I started to see more and more adults coming in wanting to sell. And I guess a certain kind of collector would have enjoyed that or really leveraged that opportunity. One of my partners went on and did that because he was a collector, and it was fortunate. But I kind of got turned off by the what's it worth kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's a shift from your focus that is player first, cards second, to cards first as the commodity. And
Right.
we talked a little bit about, and the book is really the the peak of this type of thing. The goofiness, the sloppiness of those cards. I was telling Fred probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite, vintage card. Many of you will know is the 1970 Tranquility, where he's posed, batting cage in the back, and there's a guy just wearing a towel in the back, and that would never fly in today's words or in today's world, or even as Upper Deck improved the photography and picture, there was no room for that amateurism that really made those cards more enjoyable.
Very true. That's true. Yeah, that did I wasn't really aware of it, but that really did disappear. It was still sort of existing in the late 80s, but it just got kind of wrung out of the whole process because I could just imagine the designers or people working at Topps or Donruss or Fleer being pushed and pushed and pushed to get new product out and try this design. And I guess that's still going on now, even to a more heightened extent.
So your connection now, so it's 50 years since the book, we covered a lot of this, but you see, I don't know how many people here, 25, 30 people who are taking time out of their Saturday to hear you because it's so meaningful. Could you ever have imagined that you would be such an impactful participant in this hobby, whether on purpose or not?
Not even close. Not even close. It wasn't part of the plan. The plan was to see if we could make a few bucks doing it originally.
Yeah.
And the fact that I met Harry Houghton because I had started my own baseball card store in Concord, Massachusetts, and he was a very effective literary agent, well connected at publishers. That just happened. That wasn't through anything that I did. I hadn't, to be honest with you, I had copies of the book to sell in the store, and every once in a while somebody would buy one, but that wasn't the focus at all.
Yeah.
So I didn't see it coming. I didn't see it coming originally. I didn't see it coming. What I did see coming was a possibility for a 50th anniversary edition, which I tried really hard over the last 5 or 10 years to make happen, but nobody was interested because the business has changed so much now.
Yeah.
I think the language is even different now.
Yeah, and it's true. I wonder too, a book like yours in 2023 is going to have to talk about cards from the 90s. When you think, and is there an audience for that? Do the cards lend themselves to that? I'm not sure. But I know
I think there was a possibility, and I'm saying that because as I tried to make it happen, as I tried to make a 50th anniversary edition happen, I also thought, well, let's see if I can put together a sequel.
Mm,
Maybe call the working title was Extra Innings,
mm,
and I basically auditioned two or three writers,
mm.
two or three guys who seemed to have a similar sensibility to me about the whole thing. And one of them was really good. And we made a selection of cards, and they were all wacky cards. And God knows, over the last 50 years, there've been a bunch of them,
Yeah.
And it had nothing to do with what they're worth, nothing to do with
Yeah.
investing, but it just had to try to pick up that wacky spirit of the original
Yeah.
book. Zero interest anywhere in it. But we tried.
Yeah. Well, some of your spirit lives in the SABR Baseball Cards Committee and the blog posts that many of us have written or read. So, you begat a lot of children from your book, and many of many of them are here. So if it's okay with you, if it's okay with everybody, just open the floor for questions. I'm sure everyone has a lot of things they'd like to ask or say, but it's been a real pleasure talking to you now twice in a week and getting to know someone who is so important. I do have one question. I mean, I assume Fred C. Harris and Brendan C. Boyd, I assume C's are your middle name, but
Yeah,
it seemed like a gag in itself
yeah.
to have that. And I've always been curious why.
That was a marketing decision by Little Brown.
It's so funny.
Yeah, I mean,
Have to do with, like,
we literally had partners within the publisher who got it. They got the book.
Does it have to do with, like, was it Fred C. Muggs? It's like a tribute to
That yeah, exactly. That was
Yeah,
a
it always
character.
struck me as hysterically funny.
Yeah,
Like
it
right
was.
on the cover. Why are these
Yeah.
guys? It's so funny. Anyway, sorry, that was my question. So, Jason or Nick, do you want to handle the question? Should I change to like a gallery view to see? How do you guys do this usually?
I don't know. I mean, I see RJ has his hand raised, so we can start there and just kind of go.
I
Okay.
did want to just show off something. A few years ago, I decided, for whatever reason, to start collecting all the cards that were in the book. And I took the 1991 edition that I had and cut it up and made it into a scrapbook. And I'm pasting the cards in there like a stamp album as I go. I don't have that book to show because I'm moving and it's in storage, but I did get card 189
cool.
in the mail the other day. So
yeah, wonderful. That's a good one.
60 cards to go. So, but I've
That's
enjoyed
really cool.
doing that.
Yeah.
And I wondered, the other thing I just wanted to say was, as a young fan who was just sort of starting to follow baseball at the time, I really developed I was in Northern Illinois and starting to follow the White Sox, and I really enjoyed, at the time and as now, some of the pictures of the players of the 50s, like Sherm Lawler and Manny Minoso, who that was the beginning of my appreciation of those teams. So that was enjoyable. So
that's neat. Yeah.
Thank you for this lifelong obsession that has caused many of my friends to scratch their heads and puzzlement. But
there were a lot of people who never got the book. I mean, they bought the book and never got the humor.
Wow.
I feel bad for them, actually.
Well, and especially like the Sherm Lawler section, which I think is a wonderful piece of writing. And I was surprised to learn that Sherm Lawler didn't actually play for the White Sox as long as Brendan, I assume, said. But it was just such a beautiful piece of writing that yeah.
There wasn't a whole lot of fact checking that went on.
That's okay. That's okay.
Jason, you want to go next?
Yeah, this is Jason. I know you may not consider yourself the baseball card authority on this call, but I'm going to consider you the authority for this question that may have really important implications as well for RJ's collecting journey. And that is, were one to try to collect the book, would you count the 6 older cards that are pictured, or would you just jump in and collecting the book would mean the 50s, 60s, and early 70s?
I'd probably just jump in. Yeah.
Okie doke. There it is, folks.
Yeah.
I'm building
I
a
count
checklist.
those. I count those 6 though, and I have 4.
You would count those? Okay.
Oh, they're
I'm
purists.
still
They're
gonna go with Fred.
purists.
I'm gonna go with Fred.
I
I
appreciate
also
purists.
count the ones on the cover, which I know that the 3 books have different covers with different pictures on them, so I'm probably being silly about that. But
That would be
Good
the master
Lord.
set.
I have never done this level of analysis before. This is astonishing.
Tim, you want to go next? I see your hands up.
Sure. So Fred, one of the great things about the book, among so many, is that it has such a unique and wonderful title. Is there any story behind the titling of the book?
Again, we didn't really have, Brendan and I didn't really have an idea for a title. We had lots of ideas about other things, but not about a title. So that came directly from Little Brown. And there was a lot, for some reason, there were a lot of great American this, that, and the other things that happened at the time. I can't off the top of my head reference any one specific one, but I do remember at the time it was a phrase that a lot of people were comfortable with at the time. Again, it might have something to do with the whole nostalgia, Happy Days thing. I don't know, but I don't know where it came from. But it was a work. Actually, I've gotten a lot of negative comments about the title and that it's so long. It's difficult to fit in one picture, I guess is what it is.
I'm curious to our Boston friends, and I know there are many, who had been to Fred's store. And if you had been in the store, I'm fascinated to hear from your point of view what it was like. And I assume you all knew it was Fred Harris's store, because otherwise you wouldn't be part of this call.
Well, Concord is kind of out of the way. I guess if it had been in Boston, it might have been more prominent, but there weren't that many around at the time, as I recall.
So
Mark?
I can say that I was in Fred's store, but I don't think, even though I was a huge fan and had the book from soon after publication, I don't think I did know that it was Fred's store, honestly, because I lived at the time, I would have been in Framingham, which is not very far from Concord.
Right.
It's a pretty easy Saturday morning jaunt. And I was haunting most of the local card shops, fairly regularly, largely for the, I used to refer to, when I would go to a card shop, I would tell my girlfriend at the time, there was like the barber shop on Mayberry, where you just go and there'd be a bunch of, men generally who would just be swapping stories. That's what card shops were for me.
Yeah.
And I expect that Fred was in there and I met him, but I apologize. I think it was just a card shop.
Yeah, it was kind of off the beaten track too. I mean, I say it was in Concord technically, but it was in the section of Concord called West Concord, which is on the other side of Route 2. So you had to want to go there pretty much
I also wanted to say that so I would have been in college in the early 80s, and I was in there was a bookstore in Harvard Square that had, I want to say, 50 copies of the book essentially remaindered in the early 80s. And at the time, I think
that wouldn't have been called Reading International, would it?
It might have been, but it was right in the heart of the square is where it was.
Because I ran that bookstore.
That might have been then. Okay, it was probably then. And I remember being somewhat surprised that this book, this cherished book, which was less than 10 years old at the time, was had already gotten this insult. But of course, it had many comebacks after that.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the cases that I bought. I went into that store.
Excellent.
Fred, can we ask how old you are?
I'm 80 years old.
That broke up. Try it again, please.
Oh,
80.
Well,
80 years
Fred,
old?
you don't look 80 years old, so good for you.
Well, I don't feel it either.
it's the cards. It keeps you young. Paul
That's
Ember,
what it is.
you got your hand up? Paul,
I'm sorry, I wasn't hearing.
not hearing you.
I'm sorry I didn't get any of that.
Yeah. Paul, I don't think your mic is working.
Somebody has closed captioning on, I think.
Yeah, I don't think it's Paul though. Yeah, Paul, I don't think your mic's working. Just a lot of fuzz.
Oh, you may want to just type your question into the chat and we can pick it up
Oh,
there.
that's a good idea. Yeah, type it in. Does anyone else have a question while Paul's typing?
Actually, I have a question for you guys too.
Oh, okay.
Have any of you heard of something called the Whole Earth Catalog?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that was the internet when I was writing the book.
Yeah.
I'm serious about that.
That's pretty funny.
Brett, I've
That
got
would be
another.
a good name for the web, the Whole Earth Catalog. So
Absolutely.
I have a question in the chat while we wait for Paul's. Does anyone know if the book is part of the exhibit at the Hall of Fame as it should
It
be?
is.
Okay,
It is. Yep.
good.
I was up there and I autographed it. Yeah, there's a
Nice.
showcase of books up there, and
I have a
very
question.
proud of that.
I have another question for Fred, which is, I think so many people, when they think of the book, one of the first players they think of is Sibby Sisti. And a question for you then is, if you ended up hearing from him at any time after the book's publication, I was also going to ask just maybe the inspiration for closing out the book that way, if that was you as he was a national leaguer, or just if there's any story to that.
It just, there was I forget whose phrase it was, some comedian from the 1930s who lived into the 50s and 60s.
Jimmy
Oh,
Durante.
Jimmy Durante, that's right. Good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are. And for some reason, Sibby Sisti rhythmically fit into that construction. It just worked. And speaking of players in the book who's players with cards in the book who I did meet Jim Bouton one time. And what Brendan had said about Jim Bouton is a big mouth. And at the time I was with Laureate's books, and we had Jim as a guest for Ball 4, as an autograph guest for Ball 4 in the Boston Laureate store. And I said to myself, should I tell him who I am or not? And I finally did. And we were okay, but he was still angry by that, but that was Jim. He was a unique cat, and he got over it, and we made up, and we were pretty good friends. So
I was
Fred,
going to ask if you had any other positive or negative interactions with other players who were featured in the book.
that was really the only one. Yeah.
Fred, let
He
me ask you
knows.
Paul's question. He typed it in. Did you get letters from collectors who bought the book and asked about the cards? Even though in the book you say, don't write to us. We don't know.
No, we really didn't. We really didn't get much in the way of feedback in that way. And there weren't, there was no sort of Amazon book department where people could write comments about books and stuff. So the feedback was really limited. I imagine the publisher probably got a lot of letters, and possibly the publisher sent the letters Brendan's way instead of my way. I don't know. I don't remember.
Interesting. Any other questions for Fred?
Dixie has one.
Go ahead, Dixie.
Fred, I was wondering, since I live 1 mile from Fenway Park, what town are you living in now?
Arlington.
Oh, well, you're out where Hall's Nostalgia used to be.
Absolutely. They used to be right in Arlington Center, and I lived not far away.
I remember it was a big deal for me back in the maybe 80s to go to Hall's Nostalgia, because they had just about everything that you could possibly want, even though it was expensive, but they did have it if you wanted it.
They had an impressive operation. Walter Hall was a really good guy too. I got to know him fairly well. His sons ran the store for a while, I guess, until they became older, and I don't know whatever happened to the operation per se, but yeah, they were a force. They were fun.
They certainly were. I remember going to card shows out in Wilmington at the Shriners Auditorium maybe 5 years ago, and I think that might be the last time that I saw either one of the boys out there. They were selling the last of their goods.
Okay, interesting. Did you go to the auctions as well?
I didn't. I never took that part in, but
yeah,
that's just me.
I only went to the auctions because I was then in the retail business of baseball cards, so I would look for things that I could buy, not as a collector, but as a retailer.
I know I have your book somewhere in this house, and the book is pristine. You gave me $100. I couldn't find it today.
Another question from Paul on the chat. What did you go to school for at Penn State, and will Penn State win the whiteout game tonight?
I was very happy that this meeting was in the afternoon as opposed to the evening, because we're playing Iowa tonight. I expect us to win. I expect us to win big tonight. But that's a Penn State of me talking. So
yeah.
What did I study at Penn State? I was going for a PhD in American literature. Have a master's degree in American literature, and that and probably $1.50 will get you a cup of coffee at Dunkin' Donuts these days. But yeah, it was. I enjoyed part of the the process of getting a master's degree and because all of the full professors would kick the responsibility for teaching freshman composition down to the graduate assistants, which I was one of. So but I found I enjoyed that, and never got into baseball cards. It was so far off the radar at that time. Even though many of those kids at the time probably may have bought the book.
All right. Matt Glidden, you had your hand up?
Yeah, a couple comments. It's funny, I'm actually about to hop in the car and go up to Arlington Center for a show at the Capitol. So shockingly close by.
Cool.
And secondly, I want to thank you for every time I put on any hat that doesn't fit quite right. I think, well, this sure looks like a felt gravy boat on me. And I don't know that I've been able to take that seriously anytime I see that on like a wedding registry of any kind. So are there any in retrospect, are there any phrases like that stick with you, that you have really personalized over the years, that you realize that held over the decades from writing the book or talking to people about the book?
Well, one of the joys about getting recognized in this way, and it really hadn't happened prior to, I want to say, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and maybe that has to do with podcasts and social networking and stuff like that, where I've gotten, oh, you're the guy that wrote the book. But no, not really any phrases in particular. It's always wonderful to hear about phrases that resonate with people who've read the book. That's incredibly satisfying, because these were mostly jokes, funny lines, one-off things that we traded back and forth. And then when we focused on it, we actually wrote them down, and that's where they came from. Yeah, I really got into the swing of writing a sequel, and it's probably about half done, but it's probably never going to get published, and I'm okay with that. I've reached a truce with the whole idea of getting a sequel done.
We are not okay with that. We need your will to have that donated to an institution. We need that to be available whether you finish it or not. Sorry, but that's just the truth from my perspective.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I was going to add a few things here. So number one, we do have Bill Perch from SABR Digital Publications, right? We could probably publish it as SABR if nobody else wanted it. You just wouldn't make any money.
I think the deadline's November 1st, right?
Whatever it is, man. Yeah, get it done. Two, as a Paul Skeens fan, I just got to compliment Dixie on the Altoona Curve shirt. But serious question for you, Fred. I think you would have been about 30 when the book came out.
That's about right.
And I'm curious if when you wrote it, your target audience was 9 and 10-year-olds, like many of the people on this call that read it when they were young, or if you saw yourself as writing it more for people your own age that maybe even collected cards in the 50s or early 60s.
Yeah, we really did. That's exactly who we thought we were writing for, because there were other people in the store, and every once in a while we get a little group around the stories we were swapping back and forth, and they were pretty much guys our age and stuff. So that's pretty much the audience we had in mind. Yeah, for sure.
Okay,
for sure.
So guys like Jeff and Mark were precocious then.
We were.
Yeah.
All we saw was cards. Let's see, I think Dixie, is your hand up? Is that what it
Yes.
is?
I got the shirt as one of the last places we stopped on our way back from Chicago. We didn't get to see a game, but I bought a whole bunch of stuff in Altoona. Fred,
Great
I was wondering if there was a card or two 50 years ago that were your favorite cards back then and have remained that.
Well, for sure, I don't know if I have any favorites. I like looking at the book every once in a while, but looking at the pictures of the book, I guess the Sibby Sisti card is just so powerful. It was such a coda for the whole book and the whole concept, but it probably sticks in my mind, and I think about it more than any other. And Johnny Unitas. I don't want to sell Johnny short.
Yeah. That's the cornerstone. I did have an opportunity. I think some of you know David Roth, who writes at Defector. Very much in the spirit of Fred and Brendan, particularly when he writes about baseball cards and does card events. And he'll contact me every once in a while if he's going to write about cards. He had never known about the Dave Bennett. What is it? This 19-year-old, left-hander is only 18 years old, whatever's on the back of the Phillies rookie card. That's become a long time favorite.
Yeah.
We're getting close to an hour. So maybe time for one more question, and then we could wrap it up if anyone wants to linger. Particularly if Fred wants to linger, that's fine. That's what, we don't need to see each other. We need Fred if he wants to hang out for a little bit, but I want to make sure that we get
Until the
everyone.
Penn State game starts.
Yeah, right. So why don't we do one more question? And before that, I just want to thank Fred enormously for being with us today, for Fred and Brendan for their work that meant and still means so much to all of us. Really, it's fabulous to get to know you better, Fred. And if we do a pack night in Cooperstown in the spring, you're more than invited to come and hang out and eat pizza and drink beer with a group of people who appreciate the cards in the spirit that you would align with well. So
I would love to. Thank you.
So Nick, you want to finish us off?
I was gonna say Mark has his hand raised for a last question, so he can probably give an end.
I'll be very short. I just wanted to add a couple things. One, I was another person that spent a lot of time at Hall's Nostalgia, so we may have I might have run into Dixie there and not even known it. Yeah, and also there was a place in Kenmore Square which was called Fenway Sports Cards. It didn't last that long, only a few years. I spent a lot of time there too. Anyway, what I wanted to say to Fred, essentially, because he mentioned that he thought his audience, or they thought their audience was people their age that would approach it the same way. You probably have heard from people like Jeff and I over the years, but I was 12, I think, when the book came out. And this was an age when I knew a lot of collectors who were 8, 9, 10. And then by the time you're 12, a lot of people have sort of moved on, right? That's an age where you're becoming interested in other things. And I was kind of stuck with cards, I think. And it wasn't like it was ever a point where I felt awkward about it or anything. It was totally fine. I never felt like this was a weird thing. But on the other hand, I didn't really know other people that were doing it anymore by the time I was a teenager. And when I got your book, my father who always thought it was kind of a weird that my cards were always in the way in the house, and a very good friend of his, who both of whom they're still alive and they're still, you know, they still could talk about this, essentially stole the book from me, and we're staying up late, like reading passages to each other. After that, suddenly both my father and our good friend Roger would ask me questions like, tell me about your cards. What cards do you have? Let me see them. And they had never thought that they were worthy of adult communication prior to that. And I sort of want to thank you for actually, I wouldn't say you made me cool necessarily, but at least you made me, you elevated me to a seat at the table with adults that I could talk to them, and they would ask me the same way I would ask them questions about what was it like to, you know, live through the Korean War. They would ask me like, do you have the Jim Bouton card or something?
Yeah.
And most of the cards you talked about were before my time, essentially.
Right.
They were from my young life, or maybe even before I was born, but they saw that connection, and they also saw, I think you expressed your love of sort of baseball and humor and the cards and all that in a way that I think I felt that, but I hadn't actually spoken it before.
Yeah.
And when they would ask me, I would say, yeah, just like he says, that's how I feel about these cards too.
It's Mark, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mark, you have a couple of graphics on your wall there, a Bob Dylan album, and I think it's a Marvin Gaye album cover.
Yeah,
that is right.
That
yeah.
reminds me that triggered something in my mind. One of the most important parts of growing up at that time was a radio station here in Boston, which had just started, called WBCN FM. Don't know if any of you remember that. Yeah, but even before Charles, going back to 1968, there used to be, it was the Boston College Classical Network or something, and they gave it over to rock and roll. It was one of the first sort of underground rock and roll stations where you could listen 24/7 to cuts that weren't top 40 cuts. It was so important to us, and those albums really triggered my recollection of that. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. Me too.
Well, thank you, everybody. Wait, Dixie, did you want to do one more?
Yeah, for Mark, I'm pretty sure that a part of Fenway Sports Cards still exists as Bay State coin on Bromfield Street in Boston, because I'm pretty sure my friend Andy bought it when it went out, and he's still running a card and coin store downtown Boston. And so,
all right,
that's
I'll
where I
check
know.
it out. Well,
I remember that store.
Next time I'm in town, Dixie, maybe you and I can go there. You can introduce me to your friend.
Fine.
Cool. Let me know when you're going. I'll meet you there.
If you got $500,000, you can have the store.
Well, with that, as you guys plan your social calendar, let me again thank Fred so much for his time and his storytelling and being part of some of our lives for 50 years. So thank you so much, Fred, and thanks everyone for being on the call.
Let me just say thank you to all of you as well, and thank you for that gorgeous award that you guys sent me. It's so great. It's right on my desk.
Well deserved.
Thank you.
And Fred, if you get a chance for the SABR archives, we'd love to get a picture of you with the trophy at some point. You just email.
Oh, absolutely. Will do. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right. See everybody. Fred.
Bye, guys.
We'll stay in touch. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right.
Can you do anything to end this, or is it just we
I
hang up?
was just gonna watch the progression out the door.
Okay. I have no idea if to save it or not.
No, I'll wait till the last one leaves.
Okay.
And maybe I'll see you in a couple of days.
All right. Take care. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you. That was a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
All right.
Later on.
Bye.